You can impress your esteemed guests and even yourself this Halloween with a glowing skeleton door knocker made only from Dollar Tree items. So step right up, if you dare, and get sucked into this easy yet sinister DIY. The items you'll need for this project are a plastic skull, some skeleton tongs, these mini skull buckets, these mini tin pails, some LED tea lights, and this golden plate found in the kitchen section. The first thing we need to do is determine the placement of the skull at the top of the plate. I lightly push in on the skull to make a dent and circle it with Sharpie to designate its mounting location. I'm using a piece of masking tape to create a sort of mounting template. I start by finding and marking the center of the plate and then tracing the skull's contact point onto the tape. We'll need some screws to mount everything. These are just some extras I had lying around, so you don't need anything fancy. I'm going to lay down a piece of scrap wood since we'll be drilling through the plate and take a quick check to confirm that my mini pail hinge fits within the skull's mounting area. Now, aligned with the center, we can go ahead and mark out 2 screw holes and drill on through. We can just sweep away those microplastics that'll contaminate our brain eventually, but probably not his. Then, let's flip over the plate and drill 2 countersinks for the screws. You'll need a drill bit the size of the screw head, and slowly, and I mean slowly, drill just slightly into the plate or else you'll drill all the way through. Ask me how I know. Now we can check to see that the screw fits much more flush with the plate for ease of mounting the finished product later. Let's flip the plate over and peel off that mounting template and transfer it to the center of the mini pail hinge. Very carefully use the existing screw holes to drill the screws into the pail hinge. Be very careful because if your screw is too long, it can drill through the other side, which actually did end up helping for stability in my case, but also be aware that there will be some very sharp edges on the inside that can do some damage. Ask me how I know. Now, let's prep the skull for mounting. I'm marking out guidelines from the circle on the back, down the perimeter of the jaw, and back up to the dent to mark out a slot so that we can cut all of this out and slip the skull over the pail hinge later. An X-Acto knife works well for cutting this out, but the area around the jaw is tough to cut at first, so just be very careful. Once you get it started though, you can saw through it pretty easily. After you successfully mutilated your skull, if you'd like to, you can do some cleanup work with some scissors. Now it's time to prep the skeleton hand for mounting on the hinge. You can use either hand you want, but I'm obviously using the left since it's evil. We're going to need our plate and our hinge and just eyeball the best placement for the hand. Once we found something that looks good, we'll just look at where the wire needs to cross through the arm and mark it out with a Sharpie. Now we've got one too many bones here, so in a ventilated area, if you heat up the elbows with a lighter, you can snap it like a calcium deficiency. Using a drill bit about the size of the pail's handle, we can now drill through the arm where we marked out earlier, but in order to thread the wire through, we have to carefully cut off the doubled up end. Someone in a neighboring state is probably missing an eye, but at least we can thread the wire through now. Let's use a pair of pliers to bend the end down on this wire, and then we can finally hook it back up to the pail. Now that everything is set to function properly, it's time to make our items look disgusting. Starting with the gold plate, we're going to give it a weathered sort of bronze look by slapping on a generous layer of black and brown acrylic paint, then dab the excess with either a paper towel or sponge to give it a little bit of texture. Once that's had plenty of time to dry, we're going to hit it with a streak of matte black spray paint behind where the skull and the arm will be mounted. Now I should have done this earlier, but before we paint our skull, we need to drill out some holes in the eye sockets for the tea light we insert to illuminate through. Just please be careful not to drill through your hand. We can't afford any more accidents. Now we need to take one of our tea lights and trace it out on the front side of the skull's seam. Once we've done that, we can drill a hole so that we can cut some radial slits extending slightly past the circle that we traced. The tabs this creates will be folded inwards to give a little more grip on the tea light we insert. Just be aware that your thumb can be swallowed whole. Ask me how I know. I didn't really extend my cuts far enough outside of the circle, so it did take a bit of force to get the tea light in there, but once inserted, you can secure it with a little bit of hot glue. With that out of the way, we can give our skull a much needed downgrade. I'm essentially giving it the same treatment as our golden plate from earlier, except this time I'm going to be wiping back some of the excess paint so that the highlights can cut through. Now it's time for Junior here to get lit and made over. I was hoping the tea light would be a snug fit here in the opening, but since there is some wiggle room, I'm just going to apply a little bit of hot glue around the rim, and once that dries, apply a second layer so that we can push the tea light in snugly. Give this little fella here the same spa treatment. The paint job for the hands will be a little bit different for me since I bought the black instead of the white. The black acts as a nice shadow color, so I'm dabbing a mixture of white, black, and brown to the surface, careful not to get it into the recessed areas. I'd be a skeleton myself before I got a perfect match, so close enough is good enough for me. Now that these items are looking nice and decrepit, it's important to note that the acrylic paint can scratch off, so you might consider sealing it with something like Mod Podge, but I chose not to. Anyhow, let's get this stuff finally assembled. First, I'm going to get this arm out of the way to make it easier to screw this pail onto the plate. A couple of globs of hot glue will add a little bit of structural integrity. Then we can take Junior here and put some hot glue on the fingers where they make contact with the skull. Now we can put that arm back on the pail and very carefully slide our skull over it. My skull happens to stay in place even without any hot glue. Last but not least is to add some mounting squares, command strips, or whatever method you please. Let's finally see our dark deed in action.